Welcome to today's webinar, Campbell Institute webinar, Leading Indicators from Defining to Designing, hosted by the National Safety Council, a leading advocate for safety in the United States. A few housekeeping matters before we begin. If you experience any problems during the presentation, please contact technical support at 877-297-2901. We welcome your questions and comments at any time during the presentation. You may submit questions electronically by typing them into the chat pod located in the lower left corner of your screen. Questions will be addressed periodically throughout the presentation. The link to the recording and slides from today's presentation will be emailed to all attendees. And I will now turn the program over to John Doney.
Good morning. I'm John Doney. I'm the director of the Campbell Institute, and I'm also the director of Environmental Health, Safety, and Sustainability for the National Safety Council. Welcome to our webinar this morning. Glad to have you here. I've been with the Council for about 8 years now as the National Safety Council has grown the Robert W. Campbell Award Program, which some of you may be familiar with, into the Campbell Institute, which is a group of a number of different organizations and members and partners that my colleague will tell you a little bit about in a moment. But for now, I'd just like to turn it over to Joy so she can introduce herself. She's my co-presenter on today's webinar.
Thanks, John. As John was saying, my name is Joy Noe. I am the research associate for the Campbell Institute and have been with the Council for almost 3 years at this point. For this webinar, we're going to be covering one of our key research areas that we've been looking at, leading indicators. This is an area that we've had a lot of traction in the past few years. If you are familiar with some of our previous webinars, you might find some of the first information a little bit familiar, but we are going to get to the latest phase of the research, so I hope you'll stick around to hear some of that. First, I have to say a little word about the National Safety Council. We are a 100-year-old congressionally chartered safety nonprofit dedicated to saving lives by preventing injuries and deaths at work, in homes, in communities, and on the roads through our leadership, research, education, and advocacy. We focus on areas where the greatest number of preventable injuries and deaths occur. This includes workplaces, prescription drug overdoses, teen driving, distracted driving, and safety in homes and communities, or off-the-job safety. Also, I have to say a little bit about the Campbell Institute. The Campbell Institute is the EHS Center of Excellence at the National Safety Council. The Institute was named after Robert W. Campbell, who was the first president of the National Safety Council, and we launched in 2012 with the mission of empowering organizations to achieve and sustain environmental health and safety excellence. We do this primarily through gathering and disseminating the best practices and lessons learned from our members and partners, some of which you will see later in this presentation. And our vision as the Institute is to become the trusted source for protecting people and preserving the planet. Here is the latest honeycomb of our Campbell Institute participants. As of right now, we have 36 members and 7 partners that share this original vision that we have of protecting people and preserving the planet. If you are interested in the Campbell Institute, more about what we do, or maybe even joining, you can go to our website, and that is thecampbellinstitute.org. And without further ado, I'll launch into the beginning of our leading indicators research. So this slide shows the framework for how we approach the research on leading indicators. And those who are familiar with our past webinars will recognize the first 3 steps that we have here: define, align, and refine. This webinar will spend some time on the first phases here, but we'll also cover the latest phase, which is design. So to go back to the beginning of the research in the define phase, we spent this part of the research on coming up with a definition for leading indicators, describing their key characteristics, and also outlining what leading indicators are designed to do. This phase also revealed 3 broad categories to classify leading indicators, which we will refer to as the taxonomy. In the second align phase, this is where we asked EHS experts about the current state of leading indicators, such as their organization's practices in terms of tracking and analyzing leading indicators. These experts also helped in identifying several key barriers and enablers of leading indicator implementation. In the third, refine phase, we focused on thinking about the specific leading indicators in each of our 3 broad categories of that taxonomy that we'll discuss later, and also devising various metrics to measure those indicators. And that those categories and those metrics serve as the basis for the matrix of leading indicators that we'll present to you a little bit later. And in this latest design phase that we just rolled out last year, we wanted to hear from our members how they went about developing and implementing plans to deploy, evaluate, and improve leading indicators. We've summarized their best practices and lessons learned into a familiar plan, do, check, act model that you'll see later in the presentation. And also later, I will describe 3 detailed case studies from our Institute members about how they got started developing and implementing leading indicators. So that gives you kind of the framework for how we approach this. To get into the method here, the research incorporated a mixed method approach. So for the first phase, we had an expert panel of 15 EHS professionals. We consulted them to define leading indicators and determine the taxonomy. Then we had 18 EHS experts across industries respond to a survey about their organization's use of leading indicators. And this survey revealed several barriers and enablers to implementation that I mentioned before. And in the next phase, we involved work groups, 3 work groups specifically, comprised of Campbell Institute members and partners. They worked on developing lists of leading indicators and the specific metrics for measuring those indicators. And lastly, for this most recent phase of the research, we conducted in-depth interviews with 8 of our Campbell Institute organizations to understand how they identified the leading indicators to track and also what their leading indicator data revealed to them about their safety management systems. And these methods collectively culminated in the final white paper report that we released last year. At this point, I'll turn it over to John to talk a little bit about the results.
Thanks, Joy. And as Joy mentioned at the top of the webinar here, if you've joined us for a Leading Indicators webinar in the past, a little of this might feel familiar, so please bear with us. But for those of you who haven't, we really started our research at a place where we felt that we needed to really set the table. We brought a group of folks together, as Joy mentioned, a group of experts, to really talk about leading indicators and scope out what we wanted to do with the topic. As many of you know, it's a very complex topic, one that's been around for many years and one that will continue to be around for many years more. And when this group of experts came to the table, we found very quickly that semantics began to get in the way. Everyone had a bit of a different definition of a leading indicator or a KPI or a metric, a different definition of where they kind of drew the line, in terms of things like near misses or hazards or what events kind of classified as leading indicators. So the first thing we really did, and the first outcome that we had in our research, as simple as it sounds, was to create a definition of leading indicators. So what you see on the screen is the very simplified version. If you go back to our first white paper available on the website, which we'll make sure we put up for you at the end of the webinar, you'll find the whole definition, which will look a little bit like it's written by committee because it was. But the 3 key issues here, or indicators that really roll into the definition here, are that the metric to be considered as a leading indicator should be proactive, preventative, and predictive. By proactive, we really mean to be able to get ahead of something, to be able to tackle something before it happens. Preventative meaning that it can actually affect the outcome, and predictive meaning that there's some indication or use of where or what is going to occur. Not necessarily that it will predict exactly when or who or what will happen, but that a trend can be developed using that indicator to map future occurrences. So those 3 things are really at the core of what we consider leading indicators. Your own organization may have a different definition. We encourage you to just use this as a starting point as you think about where your leading indicators program is, and develop your own definition. These are the sorts of things that are helpful in getting that common language out there into the organization about what we're really talking about when we talk about leading indicators, because so often it can be confusing for those who aren't in the weeds of the EHS profession. So that's where we started, was with the definition. And again, just following through this framework, we'll kind of continue to the first phase here. and talk about the critical characteristics of a leading indicator. So the next thing that our expert panel did was really sit down and we dreamed up, what our perfect leading indicator would look like. We said, what kind of qualities or characteristics would that metric have to make it robust? We came up with a list of 8. You can see them here. And again, in our first white paper on leading indicators, you'll find a lot of information about each of these in terms of how we define what actionable or achievable or explainable might really mean. But I'd just like to call out a couple here as an example. You see actionable, achievable, explainable, meaningful, timely, transparent, useful, and valid. Some of those are probably pretty obvious as to why they're important. You certainly want an indicator to be valid and tell you you're heading in the right direction. But certain things are not as obvious as to why they'd be important characteristics, such as explainable. I kind of mentioned this with the definition, but you can have a great metric or a great indicator. At the end of the day, if you can explain very concisely why you're tracking that, why you're using organizational resources and time and attention to track and utilize that metric, you're very quickly probably going to run into some problems, particularly on the operation side of the business. If you have a great metric that has a deep algorithm that you have to spend a half hour explaining, well, it might not be that that meaningful for someone who you're asking to track that to really get into the weeds with. So you really want to try to be able to have your elevator pitch for what your leading indicator is and explain why you're tracking it and why you're using it. Not every indicator is going to have all 8 of these characteristics. Many might not even have half of these characteristics. But if you're really thinking about setting up your program for the first time or refining the metrics you currently have, these 8 characteristics might not be a bad place to start in terms of just kind of maybe eyeballing or ranking where they fall in terms of these different categories. Maybe just give a 1 to 5 on each of these for the metrics that you use now. And that might help you understand how close these metrics are to your ideal and what you're looking for. So again, feel free to look in the first white paper. Again, we'll share all these with you in the website link at the end of the webinar. They're all freely available, and you can get much more detail on each of these categories. After we'd called together the expert panel, we kind of moved into a phase of the research where we wanted a bit broader understanding of the current state of leading indicator use in Campbell Institute organizations. So we put together a survey to our members that was really interested in a couple of key things. And one of those things was the enablers to implementation of leading indicators programs. So our members generally have had programs around leading metrics in place for several years. Some of them were in lower states of maturity on the metrics programs. Others were in higher states of maturity. But we wanted to understand that no matter where they were, they may have some common factors that helped them, that enabled them to implement and execute on these programs that they were putting together. So one of the survey questions really looked at this, and we found 4 key enablers to implementation that are listed here, and I just want to walk through those really quickly. The first in the top left is executive buy-in, and in parentheses, not technical knowledge. What we saw here in this finding was really that leading indicators programs were very successful, very enabled in organizations when the executive leadership, the operations leadership, the CEO, CFO, C-suite of the organization really bought into the program, believed that it was the right thing to do, believed that it was kind of where the organization needed to go next for metrics. They didn't need to have deep technical knowledge of the field to be able to understand why you were tracking a particular thing or why you were relying on a certain algorithm to understand something or a trend line, but they needed to be bought in kind of the heart side of the indicator program. Similarly, the next finding, corporate level roll-up and tracking, kind of goes right along with that. Organizations found themselves to be particularly successful when at least some level of their leading metrics were rolled up at the corporate level. Now, we probably wouldn't recommend, and you'll see in some of the case studies, it hasn't. This doesn't mean that every metric should be rolled up to the corporate level, but some level of high level kind of cut of those metrics is very helpful for organizations and helps get that buy-in and helps enable the program. The more visibility the leading indicators program has at the corporate level with the right meaningful metrics, even up to the board, is very important, and just tracking some level of information there is critical. Again, that's not to say that there aren't other metrics or more metrics that should be tracked at the site, regional, business unit level, but at least some level of corporate roll-up and tracking was a great enabler. A third finding, as in the enabler factor, is the predictive value of these metrics were communicated and understood. So again, this kind of goes along with the buy-in portion and the explainable characteristic, but really explaining the predictive value, the way in which these metrics could be trended, what they were pointing to in particular, and making that visible and well-known and communicated in the organization was really important as an enabling factor. And I think about this most when I think about those site-level conversations that EHS professionals often find themselves having with site leaders and operations leaders, explaining why we're asking organizations to track one more thing, and what it's going to mean for them and what it's heading toward. Communicating that was a really key enabling factor for good implementation of the program. And then the final enabling factor that we found was what we call targeted collection towards specific outcomes. And what we mean by this is that you're really tracking leading indicators that are relevant to your current risk factors and issues that you're having as an organization. And this varies greatly depending on what field you're in and what you're doing. You could find great metrics elsewhere that work fantastically for that organization because they face a specific risk or problem. They may not always port over to your organization. If you're having a lot of issues around falls or hand injuries or ergonomics, you'll probably want to create leading indicators that are targeted toward driving down those negative outcomes in those areas. So it's really about tailoring the metrics to your specific risk matrix and the things that you're working on this year, this month, or over a five-year plan to get you where you need to go. The best metric is not very meaningful if it's not related to what you're trying to achieve. So those are some enabling factors we found. On the flip side of the coin, we were also very much interested in what the barriers to implementation were. What were the challenges that our organizations were seeing? And it should be said, these are generally very high maturity organizations when it comes to environmental health, safety, and sustainability, and management system approaches. And yet there were still quite a number of challenges and barriers. The first of those was the inability to develop consistently actionable metrics. By that we mean metrics where you can kind of really go out in the field and see a change month to month or week to week. Actions that you can put in the hands of operations professionals or in the hands of site EHS leads and say, we'd like to focus on these and like to see these go up or down and want to do something about it that's realistic and meaningful. It was sometimes hard to connect and get those from the high-level leading indicators to those that were consistently actionable in the field. Kind of going along with that, the second barrier, a lack of reliable, consistent relationship. And by that we mean the relationship between the leading indicators and the lagging outcomes. In many cases, this was because organizations had very mature progress on lagging indicators, very low level of recordable rate, lost time injury, DART rate, things like that were very, very low. And what they were seeing was there wasn't a consistent relationship of, say, an increase in a leading indicator and a decrease, correlated decrease in a lagging indicator. In some cases, that's because they'd used the leading indicator for a number of years, and it was no longer as relevant at driving down injury rates as it had been in the past. In other cases, it really just wasn't a metric that gave you a good, direct correlation to something, which isn't to say it's a bad metric. It just means it's hard to correlate to another outcome on the lagging side. So this was a frustration because the more that this occurred, the more variance that occurred in the lagging side, the harder it was for these organizations to have continuous implementation of these programs. People began to think, well, maybe this isn't really the way to go, or maybe these metrics aren't telling us what we want them to. So this is just a barrier that we saw, and this is one that is, I think, a constant albatross for the field in terms of trying to find ways to express this sort of relationship. Another barrier, and I'd say again, all this kind of goes together, continued C-suite reliance on lagging indicators. So, we've been using recordable rate, DART rate, lost time for many, many, many years. It's become a second nature to boards and executive teams to think about those numbers as a proxy for overall environmental health, safety, performance, and it's a hard pattern to break. It's hard to break that same pattern where if we want to know what our production was or our revenue was or our profit was, we know what metrics to rely on. It's easy for organizations to want to have that same, just very simple metric on the safety side. And what we're really trying to do as organizations now is paint that more complex picture. So even in the most mature organizations, there's a continued reliance on that lagging rate, which is just certainly a challenge and one that we're hoping to address through the continued research that we're doing. A final barrier is sporadic, infrequent, and non-standard benchmarking. So those are three words that I think no one in a technical profession like ours likes to hear. And what we found was that, although as a profession we're generally very good at benchmarking on other topics that have been around for a while and have very procedural, maps to follow, it's a little bit harder to benchmark on things that might look different from organization to organization. And though there may be some leading indicators that we can say apply across the board, when we get down to some of those more production-oriented leading indicators that we want to look at, or some of those things that are specific to our risk, we're going to have non-standard benchmarking. We're going to be talking about approaches and programs and mindsets and sort of things that we want to pull in and resources and ways to have conversations. We're not necessarily going to be talking about what your outcome was this year, that year, or the next on a particular metric. And so, taking all these barriers together, we said we really need to do some additional research on this and make sure we're addressing some of these challenges. And as Joy will tell you soon, that's kind of where the rest of our research has been directed. But before we get there, just wanted to talk a little bit about our taxonomy that we developed. This was really kind of the key element of our second year of research was developing out a taxonomy of leading indicators. The reason that we did this was to create that common language. When we talk about non-standard benchmarking, we wanted to at least have some sort of common ground for people to stand on. And we thought about what kind of leading indicators we've heard of in the past and what kind of leading indicators our organizations are using. We kind of pulled together many people in this in our user base, our member base, and asked them, what metrics are you tracking? And we found that they really fit into probably one of three categories. Now, this isn't the whole picture. There's probably more categories that you could create in your organization or things that exist beyond these boundaries. But the three that we saw the most often were behavior-based, operations-based, and systems-based leading indicators. When we talk about behavior-based, we really aren't talking about blame or anything like that, but we're really talking about the activities, thoughts, and perceptions of individuals or groups of individuals, entire organizations, organizational culture. Those are the sorts of metrics that we're talking about there. When we talk about operations-based indicators, we're talking about those related to work processes or equipment. These are the ones that are going to be probably the most varied from organization to organization. For manufacturing, these might be your kind of assembly line and quality metrics. For oil and gas companies or chemical companies, these might have things to do with preventative maintenance and pipeline pressure and all sorts of things like that. So these are going to vary quite a bit based on the organization you're in. And then the systems-based metrics. So these are metrics that relate to the function of your management system. Things like closure rates and management of change issues. It's not surprising that a group of organizations that really has relied on a management system approach for many years would want to use systems-based metrics to track how they're doing and try to correlate those to outcomes. So these are the three categories that we created during our research and based on what we heard from our member organizations. We then spent about a year turning this taxonomy into what we call our leading indicator matrix. What you see here comes from our second white paper. And it really breaks down the operation systems and behavior-based categories of the taxonomy into another layer down, some of those kind of second-level buckets in which you could put some of those indicators that you actually use. For operations, things like compliance and risk assessment. For systems, things like leading indicator component evaluation, hazard identification. For behavior, things like leadership engagement, employee engagement. From each of these second-level categories, we have lists of actual metrics that our members have used or thought about using and maybe saw success with or maybe didn't. And that's all available in the second paper. There's a whole other tier to this with some really specific examples of metrics that you could consider using. The research is not intended to take these metrics and say, put these into use in your organization. We'd rather that you use them as a starting point and think about which ones might be right for you, either to invent your program whole cloth or to think about refining some indicators that you already use. So you can find all of that in the second paper, but it's a really a good starting point or roadmap for organizations wherever they are in their journey to think about how our categories of our taxonomy break down, where we track things and where we don't, and what ideas we could get from the Campbell Institute members about using them. So that kind of takes us through some of the foundational research we've done over the past couple of years. I'd like to turn it over to Joy to talk about some of the newer research that we've done from here.
Thanks, John. As John was just mentioning on that last slide, he was saying that a lot of organizations and people who have seen these presentations in the past have looked at the research and said, this is all great. I see examples of leading indicators. I now know what a leading indicator is and maybe some of the barriers and enablers to implementation, but they actually wanted more examples of how to go about actually implementing a program. And we gave some basic building blocks right there in the first part of the research. In this next part, we wanted to give more examples from our member companies about how they actually got started using leading indicators and have these case studies somehow inform the way that you would want to improve upon your leading indicator program, assuming that you have one already, or build one from scratch. So before I get into those case studies, however, I wanted to share with you basically 3 sets of common practices and words of wisdom that we gleaned from our interviews with Institute participants. The first one that I have here on the slide is around choosing, tracking, and analyzing leading indicators. One way to decide which leading indicators to start tracking, and this is advice that comes from our members, is to look at what is already being measured. What's already being tracked? Can any of those pieces of information that you're already collecting serve as predictors for future incidents? One example, and I'll talk about this a little later, comes from Schneider Electric. They actually were already collecting data on their safety training hours. This was just something that they were already collecting data on going back to 2003, but they had never thought about using that as a leading indicator until about 10 years later. So this is something that they were already tracking at a site level. They weren't going to burden sites with collecting more information. They just decided to look at what they were already tracking and start leveraging that as a leading indicator. Also, the bottom-up approach that I have here in the second box shouldn't be discounted. This actually means taking a look at a leading indicator that might work well at a site level, just like it was for Schneider Electric, and seeing if it can be rolled up to the corporate level. There are actually several examples of this in the white paper. I have another example from Johnson Controls where they took the leading indicators that were looked at a site level, and they thought, okay, these can be best practices at a site level. Can we actually roll this up to a corporate level? And they took those best practices from their sites and they used that to model a larger global maturity program for the entire organization. So their leading indicators really started from the bottom and then went up from there. Starting simply and small with just a couple leading indicators is also a common practice among our Campbell Institute members. Beginning with just a few to start with means that people can become accustomed to the tracking of leading indicators without becoming overwhelmed. And this process can actually create more overall support for leading indicators in the long run. A little bit of a slow to start, but gaining momentum from there. And the last box on this slide that I'll mention is to make sure that leading indicators are providing you with meaningful information. This actually goes back to that slide that John was talking about earlier on the critical characteristics for leading indicators. So some questions that you might want to ask yourself is the indicator actually measurable? Does it provide a clear path forward for actions to improve safety? And if the answers are no to those questions, then you might want to ask yourself, is this really worth the time? Tracking that leading indicator might merely become a data collection exercise without any kind of actionable response behind it. So that is the first set of common wisdom and words of wisdom that I wanted to share with you. Here is the second one. This one has the theme around gaining support and roles and responsibilities. Our research participants agreed that obtaining leadership buy-in on leading indicators is absolutely essential to their implementation and tracking. There are several examples of this in the white paper. Some organizations already had leadership support from the very beginning, so it made it a lot easier to implement those leading indicators. Other organizations, they had to do a little bit more convincing of their senior leadership in order to get them on board. One example comes from U.S. Steel, where a new leader that came on board had a lot more enthusiasm for leading indicators, and that really reinvigorated U.S. Steel's leading indicator program and put new life into it. So that's just an example of how having solid leadership support can be very important and essential to actually getting your leading indicator program out. Also, being able to speak different languages to appeal to different groups within the organization. That's also important for gaining support for leading indicators. And here I mean being able to find the right pitch with different groups within an organization, whether that be different functional areas, talking to engineers versus frontline workers versus supervisors versus senior leadership, being able to communicate the importance of leading indicators to all those various functions is essential to getting people to buy into it and to also get them to accept leading indicators as part of the overall safety management system. Finally on this slide, our research participants also recommended involving multiple departments and functions, not just the safety department, in leading indicators, and that can include departments like human resources, operations, facilities, finance, maybe even legal. And involving those multiple functions from the organization kind of elevates the entire company culture around EHS. There's a great example from Owens Corning that actually looked at the time to fill an open position, especially if it was a management position, and how that metric there, the time to fill that position, actually impacted safety. And so right there you're talking about an HR function that can have an effect on the incident rate. So this is something that they discovered, that how different departmental functions can affect each other. I will actually talk about that a little bit later. So that is the second set. Here's the third set of common practices and wisdom around leading indicator program design. This third set is around connecting leading indicators to an organization's safety management system. Many participants said that in order for leading indicators to be truly effective, they need to be integrated into the overall SMS and not just treated as a separate program. This really speaks to a need to go back to action planning on the part of like a safety manager or director in order to reduce risk across the organization. I think that also speaks back to what John was mentioning earlier about a leading indicator, a good leading indicator being one that is actionable, that actually provides that good path forward. So not just collecting information on leading indicators for the sake of collecting them, but also going back to the safety management system, what needs to be changed and what actions can we take. Another piece of advice was that while leading indicators are important, they still need to be balanced with lagging indicators in order to measure their success. Performance on lagging rates can provide clues as to the overall functioning of the safety management system and if your leading indicators are truly reducing risk. This is something that Cummins does with their correlation analyses. They actually do analyses where they correlate their leading metrics versus their laggingness, see if there's actually any relationship. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. To help understand Institute participants' advice for leading indicator program implementation, we organized some of those takeaways that I just mentioned in the previous slides into a familiar, or what I hope is a familiar chart to you, a plan, do, check, act model for continuous improvement. So if you look at this graphic, you'll see in the plan stage some of those initial tips that we already mentioned of leveraging existing metrics, obtaining input and support from management, defining stakeholder roles and responsibilities. That is, those are some good steps to put into the plan stage. In the do stage, you'll see other tips that I mentioned, such as involving multiple departments and functions, and also starting simply with a few leading indicators that will address those key risk areas that you might have. And in the check stage, you'll see those questions to ask yourself about leading indicators. Are they measurable? Are they providing meaningful information that you can act upon? This is the stage where you would also correlate against lagging indicators to determine how well your risks are being controlled. And lastly, in the act stage, you'll see tips on how our Institute organizations react to that information that their leading indicators provide them, such as redefining our indicators or maybe changing how they're measured, adding to their leading indicator suite, rethinking indicators that aren't providing useful information, and this all feeds back to the beginning of that cycle and the continuous improvement process. If you're interested in this graphic, you'll be able to find it in the pages of our white paper that you can find on our website. We will give you the URL for that in just a bit. I wanted to wrap up here with, on this stage of the research, with 3 case studies that we looked at. And you can find these case studies in more detail in the white paper. You'll also find 5 additional case studies because we interviewed 8 organizations altogether. This one is around Cummins, and Cummins began work developing leading indicators by first conducting research and benchmarking with other companies to develop their plans. And after much deliberation, they ultimately decided to start with health and safety assessments and preventive actions because these were things that they were already tracking at the site level. So this goes back to, look at what is already being measured and start there. And after tracking these 2 indicators for a year, they added more corporate level leading indicators. And they added several more, including total observations or number of observations per employee, the percent of employees trained in behavior-based safety. They also looked at safety and health training hours as a percent of total training hours, the hours worked per employee, that was to get at an overtime rate, and also the percent of new employees because that can also affect lagging indicator rates. Cummins conducts correlation analyses, I mentioned this earlier, between all of its leading indicators and its lagging rate to determine the efficacy of its leading indicators. And doing this, and doing so periodically, helps them determine if their leading indicators are actually providing actual information, and also if they're associated with positive results. These kind of periodic evaluations help Cummins decide if they should continue with certain leading indicators and or add new ones. The next case study that I have here is from Schneider Electric. And Schneider Electric, they describe their leading indicators as starting from the bottom up. So that goes back to that one key piece of advice from earlier. And this is because several Schneider Electric sites have been tracking training hours as a leading indicator since 2003. In 2013, so that's 10 years later, they started analyzing training hours as a leading indicator at the corporate level because there appeared to be a strong inverse relationship between training hours and incident rate. So as training hours went up, incident rate tended to go down. And recently, Schneider realized that tracking training hours just wasn't enough. They thought that what they were really tracking was just how many people showed up to a training on a certain day. So how many people were just warming the seats at that training session. They weren't just satisfied with that metric. What they really wanted to do was move to measure the effectiveness of that training. So this is a kind of a new indicator that they've tacked onto that original training hours metric. They looked at the effectiveness of training through checks or quizzes of safety knowledge at periodic intervals after the training was initially completed. So things like 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 12 months after the initial training was completed to see how well that safety training and knowledge stuck. Before tracking leading indicators, the only celebrations that Schneider Electric held were number of days or months since a recordable incident. And while they still consider that important, with the addition of these new leading indicators, they also want to highlight the number of leading indicator milestones. So things like number of observations recorded, the total number of training hours met, things like safety innovations. Celebrating those milestones helps gain more support for leading indicators throughout the organization. And for the last case study, I wanted to talk a little bit about Owens Corning. Leading indicators started at the business unit level at Owens Corning. One of their divisional safety leaders noticed that certain events seemed to be associated with an increase in recordable injuries. So he was noticing things like a leader or manager change could be associated with an increase in recordables. Also things like increases or decreases in labor, new build projects, percent overtime, etc. So those are just some samples and examples of how those of events that could lead to an increase in recordables. And what he did was start flagging these. These events were referred to as yellow flags. That's what he called them, to predict soft risk. That yellow flag system has become the basis for leading indicators at Owens Corning, and the leading indicators that they track at the corporate level. Percent overtime remains a really strong predictor of lagging metrics for them. And in the meantime, other leading indicators have been added, such as on-time completion of preventive maintenance or percent of unplanned maintenance activities. And at the corporate level, if any of those leading metrics falls outside of a given parameter or a parameter that they're comfortable with, that's classified as medium or high risk, and then containment actions follow from there. And something I mentioned earlier is that Owens Corning has made sure to involve other functional areas besides the safety department function in leading indicators, such as HR or facilities. So there are a couple of things associated with those areas. One that I mentioned before, the time for a senior level position to be filled, that's kind of an HR function, or the time for maintenance response, that's kind of a facilities and maintenance function. So kind of correlating those two things and looking at the connection between those departments, between HR and safety or between maintenance and safety, they're finding that there can be negative effects on safety depending upon what's going on in those other departments. And pointing out those effects for them can help them realize how everything is integrated. It can help individuals in those departments realize how their job functions and the decisions that they make on a daily basis relate to overall safety and organizational risk. So those are just the 3 case studies that I had here. I will turn it back over to John to do a summary and close us out.
Thanks, Joy. And as Joy mentioned, there are many more case studies available in the white papers themselves. We want to leave plenty of time for questions, so I will move through the next few slides pretty quickly here just to close us out. But a few key takeaways, some tips for getting started. And this is really, when we look at the latest stage of our research, the goal was to try to encapsulate a lot of the threads that we had pulled out during our first few years of work. But you've heard this from Joy already. Look at what's already being measured. Could it be a leading indicator? You never know when asking someone to track another metric is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of them being engaged and caring about safety and health at the organization. Sometimes something just as simple as saying, I need an extra half hour of your time this month to track this can be really tough for someone. And so look at what's already being measured and leverage those things. This is something that we heard from almost every organization, but Cummins is certainly a good example. Just get started. Don't spend too much time deliberating. We're a profession of engineers and scientists for the most part, and we have a tendency to overanalyze. I certainly, speaking for myself, have that tendency. So, really just get started. Tracking something for a year and seeing what you get out of it is going to be much more valuable than thinking about developing the perfect suite of 6 or 10 or 12 metrics. Just get started with something. There's always time in the future to iterate it. That's the heart of continuous improvement. Make sure indicators communicate meaningful and actionable information. This goes back to the characteristics discussion, but really have an end vision in mind for what this metric is going to tell you, and how you're going to communicate that, and how you're going to act on that information. Of course, obtain leadership support. This goes without saying. For every EHS sort of program that we put in place, leading indicators is no different. We need the buy-in of the highest level of the organization, the CEO, even the board, if we can get that. And again, this is something where there's a lot of momentum to overcome in terms of historical reliance on lagging rates, but it's something that we absolutely need to focus on and have a plan to accomplish. And then, of course, integrate leading indicators into the overall safety management system. There's a tendency to kind of treat the leading indicators program as a separate program, disconnected from some of the other functions. Or to kind of stick an individual or a group on it and kind of let them kind of run their process. It's really important to roll this back into all of the vision setting and planning and continuous improvement activity that you do within your organization for the overall system. And of course, if you don't have a system yet in place, leading indicators are a great leverage point to build that system. Just using those to start to track and look for continuous opportunities to improve is really going to be a good way to get your system jump-started. So just some key takeaways there. One other thing we like to share at the end of each presentation is, how can I use this research? It's great to see a theoretical or conceptual presentation, but it's more important to know what you can go do in your organization tomorrow with this information. And so when we developed the research framework, we wanted it to mirror the way in which organizations would actually tackle the implementation of a leading indicators program. From defining at the outset to really moving through that refining stage and designing stage. So, lead with the framework. Use that to start conversations and discussions. The taxonomy, as I mentioned, there's just really close to hundreds of different indicators scattered across the papers that we've done. Use those to start discussions. Use those to get everyone on the same page and using the same language. It's really critical. And then you can pull the real-life examples from the Institute white papers. Joy mentioned just 3 case studies. There's many more in there. And these are things that people have actually done. And certainly all of our members are glad to talk to you about these. And if there's anyone who'd love to talk to someone from a member who's done some of these things, they're usually glad to make that happen. So you can certainly let us know in your follow-up. And then find resources on the Campbell Library. So in addition to the white papers, we have hundreds of different pieces on our website. All of it's free to the public. You have to log in, but we promise not to send you anything that you don't want to get. And you'll be able to find many, many different pieces, peer-reviewed articles, procedures and practices and programs from our members that are all available there on the library. Here's where you can find the research, thecampbellinstitute.org/research, and these are the 2 most recent papers that are shown up here on the screen. There are others. There are also others on different topics. We've done papers on contractor management best practices, risk perception, leadership, EHS management system best practices, and we'll be doing more research this coming year on things like the connection between sustainability and safety, and the integration of health and well-being into EHS management. So more to come. We tend to do 2 major research projects a year, so there's always new information going up on the website. I have here our LinkedIn page for the Campbell Institute group, as well as our Twitter account, RWC Institute. That, along with the website, will give you a great portal of different information. But at this time, I think we have about 10 or 12 minutes left, so we'd love to turn it over to some questions, and I know we have a lot of them coming in, so we'll triage those, but please keep them coming in as we wrap up here. Okay, and it looks like we have a first question here that we want to approach, and I'll just read it out for us. The question is, besides actionable, achievable, etc., shouldn't leading indicators also have a valid statistical correlation between what is measured or tracked and the safety outcome you're hoping to achieve? So absolutely, and we do have that valid component, and certainly also the meaningful component. we find that some members, it's a little bit more difficult when you're getting started to start doing all that deep correlation right away. So I'd say that's kind of a secondary activity. But yes, ideally, you do want a robust and valid connection or correlation between the leading indicators and the lagging outcomes. Absolutely. Have many more questions coming in here, and I'll let Joy maybe take the next one.
Yeah. So we had a couple different questions here on what a C-suite is, and also to explain the continued C-suite reliance. So for C-suite, what we are referring to is those at with CEO or CEO or COO, CFO in their title. So the very senior level management is what we mean by C-suite. And the second question, I think, was like, what do we mean by continued C-suite reliance? Basically, sometimes those at the top of the organization can be loath to switch over to using leading indicators. They have a continued reliance on lagging. It's just something that has been established to continue to look at things like DART or the incident rate as a way of evaluating how the safety management system is doing. And so they may not be ready to switch over to looking at leading indicators. And so there might be some more convincing that needs to be done there. So that was something that, just to clarify from earlier, and that was actually seen as one of those barriers to implementation. But once you have that leadership support on board, then that really becomes the enabler to leading indicator implementation that we talked about.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just mention, we've had conversations with HSE professionals who have been, in the business for 30-plus years, talking about the historical conversations with their leadership teams and their boards, and it's really kind of the same story. We have our scorecard. We've got the production metrics, we've got the profit, we've got the DART rate, the OSHA recordable rate. And that's where it kind of stops. The conversation just kind of stops there. And so it's really about turning over that next leaf and digging into things a little bit more deeply. We had two questions here around, can we share a template where we track our metrics or examples of things to be tracked? So I just want to specify, we didn't, in the case studies, we did share some specific metrics that organizations were tracking. In our second white paper, which was one of the ones that was shown up on the screen there, you can actually find close to 100 different specific metrics that you could potentially track. There's no template or Excel chart that we use for that. It's more of a list of suggested metrics that you could engage in. So again, I would, our role here at the Institute is to collate some of these best practices. I would hesitate to give you suggestions for what specific things to track in your organization. As we've kind of shared throughout the research, it's difficult to make that recommendation across the board. There's no silver bullet leading indicator that I think works for every organization. Certainly we see a lot of metrics around things like training and overtime and new employees. Those are some of the common ones. But again, in the second white paper, there's a whole wide list broken down pretty specifically of different metrics to track. So I would encourage you to please look at those.
I see a couple questions here about how Schneider Electric measured the effectiveness of their training. While I don't have all the specifics on this, I can tell you generally how they did that. Basically what they did was they tried to implement some kind of like a pop quiz or a question that they would ask from the training at periodic intervals after the training was completed. So they would quiz the individual 2 months later, maybe 6 months later, 8 months, 12 months later on that training that they had received in that specific area. And they actually associated, I believe, prizes with that. So if they, kind of passed the quiz, there was some kind of small type of reward for that. Not being able to answer the question correctly meant that something, maybe they needed to go back and take a look at how the training was being run and to make sure that it's that information is sticking and really being effective. I'm not sure if they did anything other like actually observing the employees in action, but that could be another way of kind of performing a check on the effectiveness of the safety training that they had received. Are they actually putting into practice those things that they had learned in the initial training. So that's kind of a behavior-based safety observation as well. So I'm not sure if they actually did that second part, but that's an example of how a check could be done to look at the effectiveness of training.
Another question here, and thanks for all these great questions. There's one here around, we've talked about identifying leading indicators and integrating them into your management system analysis. What sort of thresholds could help to identify lagging metrics in a system or process already in mid-stride examples, and where you can find more resources on this? So it's a complex question. I'd say that if you're mid-stride in your management system process, the question always comes up as to when to redefine your metrics and when to set thresholds, when to review, what's kind of the baseline for an effective process or metric. We see a lot of organizations who take a yearly or maybe a bi-yearly approach in terms of looking at metrics and revising their metric suite. As far as identifying lagging metrics in the system or process, those to me are really, we've got our classic safety metrics, but I'd say think about the failures of your systems and the gaps. When we're talking about things like corrective action closure, for example, a lagging metric there could be the lack of closure, length of closure of key risk items. And so you can then spin that into a leading metric of how quickly do we close those? Do we correlate those with how risky they were, or what kind of exposure was there? So I would say start by taking a long view. You don't want to just reiterate your metrics program for the sake of it, and a year or two of runtime seems to be about the right kind of amount to really understand whether your metrics are effective. The variance in the short term can be pretty significant. So just usually wait an hour or wait a year or so to see what that looks like.
I have two things I wanted to address real fast. One is I saw some questions regarding how to actually what kind of models do these organizations use to look at the leading and lagging indicators and conducting correlation analyses. I see a comment here from Rich Sorrenzio at ISN. So hi, Rich. I know you're out there. He actually works at ISN, and he says that they run correlative analyses for their customers using negative binomial models for predicting results for both lagging and leading indicators. And he's willing to send an example to the group, so maybe that's something that we can include in our follow-up emails to you all. There's also a question here about the kinds of industries that were included in the research. So specifically, in the research and case studies, have we been able to incorporate any companies where work is primarily done within the office? And this would be very interesting to us too, as well. The National Safety Council, we are an office-based environment. It would be great to have those leading indicators, as this person mentions, in indoor air quality, ergonomics, or slips, trips, and falls. The organizations that we interviewed for this research, and primarily are what make up our Campbell Institute membership, are not office-based, so we did not do any specific research that looks at, in this industry. However, that would be something good to incorporate later on. We have actually acquired some new recent members to the Institute that are more office-based, so perhaps that would be a good addition to bring them in for another round of this research, another phase of this research. But yeah, thank you for the comment. And most of the industries, if you look at our Campbell Institute membership, a lot of them are manufacturing, heavy manufacturing. So they may not be the best suited for looking at office-based leading indicators. But we do know that some of our membership does have specific programs for their office-based staff. So maybe that's something that we can share with you in the future.
It looks like we have time for maybe one more question, and I'll actually loop in two questions here to combine them, so do a little bit of double duty here. We got a question around whether the research covers debatable indicators such as tracking your misses, as well as a view on using serious injury and fatality exposure as a leading indicator. And just to kind of maybe try to link those two concepts, I almost always get the question when we present this research as to whether near misses are a leading indicator or a lagging indicator. I think that ultimately they represent an exposure, and it's really up to the organization to decide how to treat that and what to do with that exposure. But SIF potential, out of any exposure, is certainly a metric worth tracking. And I think right now the conversation is really turning toward how we do that better as organizations, how we do that better in the hazard ID process, in the near-miss process, in the post-incident analysis investigation root cause process. There are really kind of, I think, gaps at all of those stages where we can do better in terms of tracking potential for SIF. Not every injury is created equal, and I think we're probably all fairly familiar with some of the more recent research showing a certain percentage of potential out of almost every incident that kind of cuts its way through the traditional safety pyramid. We'll be exploring that issue more in the coming years as an institute. Our members are certainly very keen to continue to explore that. So you should expect to hear from us in the future with some research discussion, presentations, and resources on that very topic. But thank you for those questions. Those are very good ones. We do have several more questions that we'll try to get to offline. Thank you again for sharing all of those. It's been a fantastic group of questions on our side, very stimulating for us. We hope this was a great webinar for you as well. We will make it available for you, and you'll see some email from us after the fact here as we close out. Joy, anything you'd like to add before we leave?
No, that was just it. This video of the presentation should be available within the next couple days, assuming everything goes well. So thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye now.